Kim and Romantha, why did you make a documentary about sex? Let's start there.
Okay, well, I think there's a difference between how we got together and how we banded together, and why both of us separately decided to want to work together and do this show about sex and pleasure. For me, on a personal level and also professional level, I've been working in the sex positive and sexual reproductive health and rights space since around 2014. And so I've always been interested in mainstreaming conversations and bringing conversations about sex into spaces where people tend to be a bit weird about it, where people are like, I don't want to talk about this, yet they will maybe go home and be very conservative or say very negative things about sex, or not, without fully understanding what they're really talking about when it comes to both sex and pleasure, because this documentary is both about sex and about pleasure. So for me, I've always wanted to talk about sex, have these discussions, and see, what can happen when we are properly informed about sex and about pleasure, where there's no myths and old tales coming through, where we are acting on things that we are taught but not understand, and where we're not fully informed in a proper manner. And so for me, this was the reason why I wanted to do this documentary series. And so when this beautiful journalist here, Romantha, sent me a DM on Instagram being like, yo, I've seen the work that you do, I fucks with it, can we meet up and see how our powers can align? I said yes, without even thinking about it. And, a year later, here we are, having created this 8-episode, and, you've watched one of them. So yeah, that's my reason.
I've only seen one, but I am a fan. I really have to say this, to the point where I do want to say this. My partner is a medical doctor, and she teaches medical students. And I said to her, this episode, you've got to get it. You've got to show it to your class. And I also just want to say, I sometimes help them, the medical school, with videos. So I've done small things like this. So I kind of know what goes into a big project like this, and this is a big project. Romantha, do you quickly want to just add on to this before we continue?
Because yes.
I want to talk about the normalization about sex.
Yes, absolutely.
That's something that Kim has actually just touched on. But how do you see this? Why are you so nosy about sex?
Isaac, ek wil net eers sê, it's such a big compliment to us, people who sat there, who had this idea, who was like, we wonder how the question, how do you experience sex, how do you explore sex, how do you see sex, those three main questions, how people will react to them. And trust me, starting off this project was a eye-opener in itself, even before we started shooting. So just back to your original question, when I watched a similar show about sex and about how people perceive sex, I realized that there's so many gaps. There's so many gaps that we do not address. We brush over the sexual trauma. We brush over consent. We brush over tiny little things that make sex still a little bit of a taboo. So I watched this specific show and I walked away still feeling like I just watched a dirty little secret. And I shouldn't have been watching that show. And it was like, so I had the feeling of, I probably shouldn't have watched, because that was kind of hectic. But there was nothing educational. There was nothing inviting me in. It was more like, let's dive deep into the deep, dark den of sex and kinks and pleasure. And that's really not how ordinary people experience it. And so I think what we wanted, when I initially saw that show, I was like, okay, there's so many gaps. And my journalism mind went, there's more. There's more to go and dig. En ons as joernaliste, ons hou van krap wat dit teekie. So I thought, let me go
scratch. As jy
krap
vir plesier, dan mag jy dit ook doen, hè? Maar okay, let's get to the point. Okay, that's true, Yeah.
Exactly. Ons hou van krap wat dit teekie, but this is the itch that needed to be scratched.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? Everyone has this itch. Everyone is hiding it. Everyone puts topical cream over it. But in fact, we should just scratch it. So that's where I was like, let me liaise with someone who has a different superpower, as Kim says, from mine, which is, a variety of people that a network, and also just being educated mostly on what queer folk experience when it comes to sex and pleasure. And so, yes, we combined superpowers. I slid into her DMs, and I think after the initial exploration, trying to find people for this documentary, we felt that South Africans are really, really eager to speak, but once they hear it's going to be on camera, they're like, oh no, my mom's going to see it. Oh no, what's my boss going to say?
Yeah.
So yeah, I think that societal pressure stopped a lot of people from telling their story in this documentary. And I commend every single person who stepped up to the plate and say, I want to be the change. I want to say something because I think my experience is valid and so many other people have the same experience. So that's where we ended up.
But may I now just basically I want to latch onto something that you've actually mentioned. And I mean, we recently, there was another show also about sex. And I'm not going to go into that, but I kind of got the feeling that a large part of it was to say, let's try and needle people a little bit. When I saw your episode, though, the exact opposite was what was true. I kind of thought, okay, I've seen a few porn movies in my life. And then I saw yours, and I thought, oh wow, this is different. This is something that, had my mum been alive, I would have watched it with her. Wow. And I think that is actually a hell of a compliment to you guys. My mum was a Afrikaanse tannie. She was not conservative in the wrong sense of the word. But boy, I mean, when it came to sex, I mean, I think she gave me one lesson, and that was, sex is om babas te maak. En jy moet asseblief nie seks hê voordat jy trou nie. That was the be all and end all. My dad was slightly more proactive. He one day sort of walked into my little room where I lived, and he gave me a little blue book. It was what elke seun behoort te weet. And he said, I think you should read this. And he walked out. We never spoke about it again. I never read the book because it was utterly boring. But, the point is just, that's exactly the issue. And you guys suddenly talk about sex education. You talk about sex, how to talk about sex. You talk about how to normalize this discussion.
I want to add to that.
So good. Sorry, Kim, go ahead. Yes.
No, I want to add to that. It's that what I found that a lot of the times we say advocacy starts at home. We have to have these discussions with our parents. We have to have these discussions with our kids. But that is oftentimes the places where it is the hardest. It's the most difficult place to go and actually change things or change the norms that's been created because of various power dynamics, etc. And so the beauty of a project like this is that, as you said, if your mom was still alive, you'd be able to sit with her, you'd be able to watch this episode, and there are experts outside of the home. There are people who have experience, there are people who have studied many years through various platforms and mediums to be able to have this conversation in the homes. And so for me, I think that is the beauty of especially the first episode, is that the things that we try to tell our parents or the things we try to tell our kids, but it's not landing and we don't know how to get that connection properly, we can all sit together now, if you're over 18, of course, and watch this show and try and understand, what is this type of education? How does this work? And how can I do better at my parenting? Or how can I be a better child to my parents? Or how can I talk about sex within the home? And so I think that's the power of an episode like this.
Well, legally, yes, we have to say that there's a 2 to 18 restriction on it. And I think it's a legal issue that we need to just address. But with all due respect, I actually think that with parental guidance, 14-year-old, 15-year-olds would actually benefit from your show. But I
agree.
I agree.
We do have sorry, just before you continue, we do have a legal expert that speaks about the age of consent. And if the age of consent is 16, why do we only get to have these conversations when they are 18? So even legally, in terms of broadcast regulations, I mean, that also goes to show that the conversations around sex happens too late.
It happens
too late. And it also shows how sex is censored.
Yes.
Of course. So like now there's this parenting and education episode, but we can respect why it's an 18 plus, right? There are a lot of topics and themes that I think need some filtering through, At the same time, it also speaks to a larger issue about sex in society where we are censored a lot. If you work in the sex industry, whether it's porn to even just advocacy work and policy work, we're censored all the time. And so this is essentially where that relationship, where it starts to form, I guess.
Exactly. But now let's get back to the reason why I'm so keen for people to see your show is, I mean, exactly, it's parents I mean, Romantha, right towards the end of that first episode, your two parents are put on the spot. Oh, sorry, not Kim, Kim's. You put Kim's parents on this. Anyway, that's lovely. But I mean, people should watch the show just for that. I mean, that was just such a moment where Kim's dad just kind of, at one point. Anyway, that is just so beautiful. But
listen, I love them both. I love them both. I really, really love them both. And I've met them before the interview. Absolutely. And I think the contrast between Kim and her parents, or their parents, are just it's exactly that. Because you have yourself as an adult, right, who's out in the world, and you're there, you're trying to find your sexual freedom, you're trying to find your sexual maturity and your sexual self outside of your parents. And then when you see where you come from, you are like, wow, you can see the difference between the two generations. Here you have a very sex positive, queer activist and someone that's in the space, and you have two parents who still come from old school and who sit there and say, we didn't think it was needed to talk to her about it. And lucky for them, Kim turned out to be someone who just embraced their sexuality. But in other cases, you do get people, because it's never spoken, you can't possibly even fathom sitting with your parents. So I think that was a beautiful contrast to show people that even as a sex positive person, I don't necessarily come from an extremely liberal home where everyone walks naked all the time. You know what I mean? So yeah, I love them both. Shout outs to our auntie.
No, there are a number of issues that just those few sentences have encapsulated. But I want to just come back to one small thing before we continue, and that is the reason why I think this should be seen by parents and by teachers. Let's stick just for a moment those two, and then we continue on to the other conversations here. Is exactly that the kind of conversations that parents are scared to have with their kids. This will help them address that. So, okay, even if you don't want to show it to your kids under 18, at least watch it yourself, parents, so that you can know how to address this. So that you can talk, so that you can understand the legal issues. I mean, that legal expert who talked about the age of consent, brilliant part of it. And then, of course, the other thing is teachers. I mean, you found the most wonderful, and I'm going to call her a tunny for want of a better word, to address the issue of about how do we address sexuality in schools. And there were a number of them, but I mean, that headmaster that you had there was just so refreshing. She honestly looked, and I'm saying this with a lot of love and absolute respect, she looked like a goeie tannie. But boy, she blew my mind with the open-mindedness in which she addressed these issues. And she was not just bashing teachers saying, you have to do this. She came from a moment of understanding. And this, that was so beautiful, because a lot of these issues that you talk about, and we can talk about queer issues and all of these things in a moment, but to me that was the essence of this show. The first episode that I've seen was there is respect for diversity, including those who are scared. Do you want to comment on that before we continue on to
absolutely, Kim? I'll let you take this one. You can take this one, Kim.
Well, firstly, when we comment on that headmaster, one of the beautiful things that she said during an interview, I don't know if it made the cut, I don't remember, but she said, I also had to have these difficult discussions. I also had to go through a change of self in order to get to this place where I can be the headmaster of the school and where I can have this open-mindedness in order to speak to my kids, and also being able to know how to navigate, the various power dynamics, parents, kids, teachers, and bringing all of that together. And so that Tani that you speak of also had to do the internal work, which was firstly fantastic to hear coming from her privately in this interview. And then in terms of the fact that everybody can see themselves in here, I think myself and Romantha, and then of course our production company, IJ Candy, Showmax, all of us together, it was very, very important to us. The number one thing was each and every person must be able to see themselves in this documentary series, whether you are a problematic person, or you have conservative ideals, or you are liberal, or you are more outspoken, or you are more reserved, whether you have been through sexual trauma or not, whether you're just here to really fucks with it and you're curious and see, what's going on. it was very, very important to us from the get-go, from the jump, that this is not a documentary about straight people or a documentary about queer people, but that we can all sit together, that we can all be interviewed, being asked very similar questions, and that we can answer from a sense of self and from how we identify, regardless. And so that was, I will say, that was a very good thing for us to sit around a table and be like, this is what we want, and this is what we're going to do. And I'm glad that it has translated to people like you, Isaac.
So Isaac, if I can just add to that, Kim mentioned a very important thing about everyone is supposed to see themselves, no matter if you are straight or queer. However, in the initial conceptualization, Kim and I sat and we're like, we know that people are going to speak about their gender identities, people are going to speak about their sexual identities, and we did not want to make this an obvious separation between straight people or heterosexual people and queer people. So, I mean, gender did come up and we decided, no, we're not going to do a specific episode about how sex is perceived throughout the genders or on the gender spectrum. We are going to allow people to speak within an episode that includes everyone, and we do not want to say, oh, how does trans sex happen? How does homosexual sex happen? How does straight sex happen? Because I feel like people from these minority communities already are put in boxes. Yes. And I just want to ask the question, how do you experience, explore, and perceive sex from your point of view? Whether you speak from the lens of being a trans person, or you speak from the lens of being an older person, a black person, that is totally your perspective, and they come through in each episode. So I think it was also important for us that we did not want to segregate on the gender spectrum. We wanted everyone to come as they are, irrespective if you want to talk about your queerness, if you want to speak about your transness, just come to the table and have the chat. So often we want to put each other in boxes. Oh no, Isaac, you're in an age group, so you shouldn't be speaking on this topic. And so that's why we also have an age episode. Because even those people are put in boxes, and you know our bodies doesn't do what it needs to do after a certain age, but also throughout the decades, how does sex change and plays will change, and how do you have to adapt? So yeah, I think we did not want to place people in boxes specifically. Just come to the table, have the chat, and this is the topic.
May I quickly show my shirt, just to say?
We love it.
And I need to give a shout out to my colleagues at LitNet. When I told them I'm going to disappear now to have a conversation about sex, they asked, what is the dress code? And for a moment I thought, I'm going to have to be very careful what I wear to this. So anyway, so this
we are so happy. We would have preferred shirtless, but we understand.
Oh, I can take it off.
In agreement, Romy. I'm in agreement.
Okay.
You know what? Thank you.
But this to me is quite important because we're addressing queerness. I mean, Kim, you yourself basically, when we talk about pronouns, you said, well, call me whatever because none of them work. Now, the point is just that we live in a society that are so boxed in, Romantha, your term, is that people say, oh, if somebody is trans, automatically we can't be friends. Or if somebody, is queer, automatically we can't be friends. And again, you put all of these things into something which I could understand, but you had experts. How did you put all of these things together without just freaking out? You really had very good people speaking on each issue. I love that.
Yeah. So I think when it comes to our experts, it really took a little bit of digging to find experts that will have a neutral view. Experts that are not outright sex positive and experts that are not outright conservative. I think when people often have a particular topic in mind, it's easy for biases to creep in. So I want to speak to Dr. Tlaleng because I know she's going to be sex positive. Or I want to speak to Dr. Ramlakan because I know he's more conservative. And I think we found a good balance. It's sometimes you don't know beforehand. You only know what is put out there because we always sit there and we do research on Isaac and see what kind of research is out there based on Isaac's work, and then we say, okay, this looks like a little bit of a more neutral comment, so let's go. And sometimes we, obviously because of how production works and how things pan out. Sometimes the experts we wanted were not available, so schedules were clashing. But at the end of the day, the beautiful thing about this project is that it all came together with the right people. So whoever was supposed to be in there is in there, and I think there's a balance between even your liberal Blankensee, Heather Blankensee, who's the principal of Sacred Heart, a little bit more liberal, but then you also have a Rosemary Rakwena, who's an allo teacher, and who's a black allo teacher, and who's not necessarily as, if I were to ask her about queerness in the schools that she teach in, which is in the east of, I think it's Benoni or Germiston, somewhere there, and it's a very rural school. If I were to ask her about queerness in school and non-binary, I think we would have definitely seen the contrast between the two. But because I know the kind of school that she teaches at, it comes through. You can see that there's a little bit of a reservation when it comes to the kind of things that they teach in their schools. And we did want to bring that reality across. So as much as it might sound like this is a very queer positive, sex positive documentary, we managed to find the middle ground. We managed to find people who are knowledgeable, but who do not necessarily adhere to a more open, a more free principle. For her, this is the curriculum, we teach it, and this is what we do in the classroom. It's pretty straight cut. Whereas Heather said she's open because of her personal life experience. And I think what's very important, what we found, Kim and I, is that there is a distinct difference. There's very few, if I have to speak about racial binaries now, there's very few white people in this documentary. And we did that on purpose because of the demographics. See, that's the thing. That's the thing. So we wanted to make it representative of the people who hardly ever get to speak about it and who hardly ever want to speak about it. And that's people of color and black people. You will hear that every single black person, except for, there's an exception of one of two of them, but every single black and person of color in this documentary will say, didn't have the sex talk, don't know how to speak to my children, or I'm not going to have it, or I'm just going to ask the teachers to do it. Even the professionals will tell you that. And so there is a contrast between what happens in people who are not black and not people of color, how it's a little bit more open and it's a little bit more accessible. It's not as it should be, because I don't think you'll ever get the sex talk you deserve or that you want from your parents or from a sense of authority. However, there is a distinct difference. And so that's what we noted early on, that for black people and people of color, it is still so rooted in religion, tradition, and culture. And that's why we have the last episode, because we want to end it with, after you've seen all of this, now let's talk about the origin of why people feel the way that they do about all of these 7 topics. Then we get to the core of it, which is ultimately, we all are rooted in culture, we are all rooted in religion and spirituality, which sometimes makes us think twice. The morality steps in, you shouldn't do this, the lines, they all step in. So I love where we took it, but it's also very, very open. And as Kim said, and it's probably a repetition, we wanted everyone to sit there and say, oh yeah, my mom did the same. Oh yeah, my mom did the same. So I'm glad you found that.
Yeah, I want to add to what Romi's saying. Romi spoke now more about how, we got our guests and how we got to having them on the show, on the series. But in terms of the themes, I think what we did was we looked at those themes and we thought, now let's talk about parenting and education. Who are the parents that are generally highlighted? What type of education is already out there? We know that there's a lot of education out there on reproductive sex. We know this. We all went through the system. I had my OBE schooling. We know that reproductive sex is the sex that is focused on. So now, and then in if you flip the definition of sex, when we look at the sexes, we know that there's a lot of focus on male and female bodied people, or those who have a vagina and a penis. What about those who are intersex? What about those parents who give birth to an intersex baby and has absolutely no idea what the fuck to do and is at the mercy of whatever doctor delivered their baby or medical practitioner, but they themselves are not informed about it? That was another important aspect for us to bring in here. So there are, so what is the mainstream or the most focused on education that is already out there? And so for us, it was important to look, so what are the subheadings for us? Who else can we bring on to speak about the type of education that we never received? I only found out about intersex people when I went to a fellowship in New York. I knew about intersex people, but I didn't know anything else about them. It wasn't something in my language that I could understand. And so this is another part when we come to the content aspect of it, what we wanted to make sure we get out there. When we talk about education, let's not reinforce what's already out there.
Exactly.
Let's reinforce that, but add the pleasure, add the different type of parenting styles, add the different types of bodies that exist out there, and add a lot of the education that is already out there, but people are just not engaging with.
My life partner is a medical doctor. I happen to know that in intersex, there was, for a very long time, when a baby was born, a medical doctor would say, it's easier to make a hole than a pole. You may have heard that. And so suddenly you have this intersex baby that suddenly just were given a small vagina, and off she was then sent off into the world without any idea of what that person in their mind actually internally is, or who that person really feel they ought to be. There was no education to the parents. There was, and so that is something that has happened, and you address that in a very small way, but a very pertinent way in how exactly that. Let's talk to parents about what happened, and that's why I say, to me, this is, this is sex education 101 as far as I'm concerned.
Yes.
I think everybody should.
I think so many parents are ill prepared for even just the hetero conversation. And I think one of our parents in there mentioned that you're prepared for the sex talk, but you're not really prepared for the gender talk. Like, yes. What am I, mommy? Why do they ask me these questions? Yes. Am I a boy? Am I a girl? And so, Kim, I could only amplify what Kim was saying, but I think an interesting fact that didn't make it to the cut was based off of what you just said. The medical practitioners would base their decisions on the surgery. Dr. Ramlakan also mentioned that because of the history of children being reared as boys, I think actually he mentioned that children were reared more as boys than as girls because of, traditional and cultural things. Therefore, we have a huge fertility issue in provinces like your Limpopo, Mpumalanga, because those are people who are more culturally rooted, and they would say, oh no, we choose it to be a boy because of hierarchy, because of cultural status, and therefore a lot of people only find out that they are intersex when they are adults, when they are married, when they want to have children. And usually the women is blamed for infertility issues, but very often because they are reared as boys, they don't know that they are intersex. So now we sit with couples and marriages that are technically in disarray merely because doctors decided this is going to be a boy instead of a girl. So that's probably another documentary on its own.
A
whole one. And I think we should have that documentary. But I mean, that was a tiny little part of sex and pleasure. And I want to get back to the pleasure part, because to me, I think this is the really stunning thing. And I wanted a word that both of you have mentioned. Please explain sex positive to me. Remember, ek's 'n ou oom met baie minare. Wat beteken sex positive, mense? Ek verstaan nie daai term nie. Sê gou vir my.
Maar jy is sex positive, Isaac. You're sitting here and you're busy and you're using the medium that you work in. You're using it in conversation. Jy praat vrylik oor seks, en jy weet jy het 'n partner wat ook die werk doen om mense op te lei in seks wat positief is en seks wat 'n goeie impak laat. So I think when we say sex positive, everyone can be sex positive, and people are sex positive in various ways. It doesn't always mean that you're out there naked showing your body. Sometimes it means that in tiny little ways you allow people the space and the safety to express themselves sexually, and yourself as well. So that's how I define it.
And the expressing of yourself, I 100%. Sex positive is just that you are cool, you're okay with people sharing their sexual experiences, but you're also cool with people who are like, nah, I don't want to fuck, I don't want to have sex, it's not for me. But it also, if you're someone who doesn't want to have sex, you also just provide that space for other people to be okay with it. Sex positivity isn't this intense term that you need to go and Google or whatever. It just means that you have a positive and open attitude towards sex, regardless of where someone is coming from. And that includes people who have different views to your own.
So, for instance, someone who's very, very conservative can be sex positive, because it's all about allowing everyone, you are confident in who you are as a sexual being or a non-sexual being, because I think one thing that we were unable to touch on is asexual people who do not even have any sexual desires for another human being, or perhaps, it's defined differently, but for me, asexual people are people who are not necessarily going to say I'm sex positive, but they can be sex positive because they are allowing free spaces for everyone around them to express and experience themselves without judgment. So it doesn't mean that I have to be liberal. It just means that I am open to other people's experiences and I accept them as they are. So you can be queer positive, you can be LGBTQIA positive, and they are all the same thing. Positive just meaning you allow people to be who they are around you, and you know who you are, and express yourself confidently.
Okay, so in other words, sex positive, that brings me to another issue that you addressed in the first episode, which I've seen, and that is consent. Because I think, to me, that's possibly one of the biggest issues that a young boy or a young girl today has to deal with. On the one hand, we don't get any education. On the other hand, we are curious. I mean, mense, as almost weet. And then you see somebody and you think, and then the question is, how do I approach that person? Am I allowed to? Number one, and number two, how do I do that? And how do I read the cue?
Well, I think when it comes to consent, the first thing people need to know is that anyone under the age of 16 cannot consent to sex. So if you're older than 16, do not even, that is not where the kids under the age of 16 are unable to consent. Of course,
don't say, but she looked 21 or she looked.
Yeah, that's not the point. Yeah. The point is anyone under the age of 16 cannot consent. That's a blanket statement. There are some niggly bits, but you can watch a documentary series to understand.
Do watch the legal experts on that.
Watch the rest. Do watch the legal expert, but blanket statement, no one under the age of 16 can consent to having sex, right? Then secondly, there's a variety of ways that one can consent to things. In the advocacy spaces where people are talking about sex, about consent and trying to get, the language of consent out of there, there's a big focus on enthusiastic consent. Now, enthusiastic consent is when I'm like, hey, Isaac, I want to hold your hand. Can I hold your hand? Like, may I? And you say, yes. You enthusiastically say, yes, please, I want you to hold my hand. That is enthusiastic consent. But there are a variety of ways of consenting. To touch on another note, when it comes to enthusiastic consent, I find that in my partnerships, initially, if you're just starting to be physical with someone, or you're just starting to be sexual or physical with someone, enthusiastic consent is great because you can get those verbal cues, right? That tell you that it is okay. But the longer you are with someone, there are other forms of consent that you can start picking up in body language. Someone asking for your consent using their bodily cues. Someone retracting consent in the moment, but using their bodily cues. And these are things that you can pick up the more you are with people. So I think consent, yes, there is the very, very big and very, very important focus on enthusiastic consent, purely because you get that verbal cue. But there are so many people out there who have had sexual trauma, who all of a sudden their throat boxes get clawed up. They can't actually say anything in that moment, even when they want to say yes. They're unable to say yes because they have had a sexual trauma or something happened in the past. So there's a variety of ways that we can dissect consent and try to understand consent. But I think the safest and the one that's the most important is that enthusiastic consent, especially as you are finding your way sexually. Now, of course, another thing is that consent is not only sexual. I've now focused on the sexual aspect of consent, but you can start teaching consent to kids the moment that they're born. I read an article a couple of years ago when people dragged this woman. She said, when she changes her baby's diapers, she asks for consent. Now, of course, the clickbait was, I ask my baby if I can change her diapers. That's not what she said. What she said is, it's a conversation. I will use my inflections and I'll tell my baby, okay, baby, can I change your diaper now? And obviously still change the diaper, but it's about starting that conversation, that relationship with your child. Yes. Where you tell them what is about to happen. I'm going to put your underwear on now. I'm going to redress you now. I'm going to put you in your car seat. We're going to go to auntie whoever's house. It is that type of relationship where the kid is brought in to the conversation, regardless of, obviously it is going to happen. I am going to change your diaper, but I'm trying to cement that foundation where there is consent even between parent and child, regarding a whole lot of other stuff, not just sex.
Net om by te dra, Isak, jy weet ons hou van soengroet, and I think that is something that should be abolished, honestly. With COVID has showed us, asseblief, kan ons net ophou om mekaar te soengroet, dis okay, 'n handdruk, miskien 'n warm drukkie, dis fine, en maar ook daar, jy weet, vra vir consent. Can I hug you? And I think consent goes beyond in the household. It goes how you treat strangers, because once you get into the habit of asking for consent will not be such a big thing in the bedroom. And I think a lot of, if you make it a muscle, which your brain will already just adapt to, in the bedroom it will not be a big thing. So when you go into a meeting, I think COVID also taught us to ask, what do you do? Do you do a handshake? Do you do an elbow? What do you do? Can I hug you? And I think that also is just nature telling us, listen, please be aware of people's faces. And the same way that you are aware that you're not going to go and touch someone's belly that's pregnant, do the same in the bedroom. Ask for consent. And I think the Me Too movement and the Time Is Up movement really opened people's eyes to consent and the fact that it can be withdrawn at any point in time. And I think once you realize that no one belongs to you, no one's body belongs to you, and even if you birth that body, it still doesn't belong to you.
Even if you're married.
Even if you're married, I mean, there's couples that speak about we've given permanent consent, and I really want people to see that episode as well, because even in marriages, as Kim says, in long-term relationships, it becomes very murky as to, as ek omdraai in die middel van die nag and I, push my bum out, is that me giving you consent to go ahead, or you know what I mean? And sometimes these non-verbal cues are great, but they need to be a topic of discussion. You need to ask, babe, when you did that, does that mean? Or, should I ask you? Or is it, is that my signal? And it's all just a conversation. And I think it all comes down to A, creating a muscle when it comes to consent, and B, having the damn conversation. Just ask.
Yeah. No, sorry, why I'm saying this is exactly what your episode that I've seen shown me is. It's about talking to people. And that, to me, I think it's fantastic.
That's the premise of the whole documentary.
I think that's the premise. Let's talk about it. And then the last thing I want to touch on, because we're talking for a heck of a long time now, and your consent on your time is going to run out very soon. But the lovely thing was exactly that. It was so interesting how respect was. It was kind of, that was the bottom line. It was respect of the other. Respect of that space, whether it's a parent who needs to respect the child, or whether it's a teacher who needs to respect the child, and vice versa, whether it is a partner who needs to respect the partner. I mean, that was such an important part of where you guys came from in your documentary. I love that.
Listen, I love how you're just busy dishing out all of the sub-themes, because it means that we don't have to go and dive deep into it. I'm glad that it's that obvious. We're also just very happy for people to just enjoy the episode, have fun, laugh about it, go into your memories of what happened, have a discussion about it. I think the big part is let's talk about our own experiences and how we can do better.
I think talking, that's exactly what it's about. I loved it, guys. I'm going to promote it heavily to everybody, because I really think this is worth watching. And well done to both of you.
Thank you so much.
Ek hoop jy geniet die ander episode soos jy die eerste een geniet het ook.
Ek wil hulle almal weer kyk, regtig.
It was literally a labor of love and a lot of pleasure for us to create for everybody who's going to watch.
It was a pleasure to view it, and I think that is the important thing.
Yes.
Yes.
Enjoy.
Exactly. Thank you. We hope everyone enjoys
Dankie
the series.
Isaac.
Dankie julle. Mooi gaan.
Bye.